This is the DarshanTalks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. I'm an attorney. I'm a pharmacist. I advise companies on FDA-regulated products. So if you work in or have an interest in FDA-regulated companies or their products, this is the podcast for you. Today's podcast is actually really interesting. And the reason I think it's interesting is we have a really special guest. The individual we have is the CEO of Factomizeorg. It's a nonprofit which represents medical information leadership of over 30 pharma companies. Factomizeorg is an industry-wide consortium that focuses on increasing the awareness, credibility, and access to medical information. Prior to joining Factomizeorg, our guest worked at Bristol Myers Squibb, where he held various leadership roles within the R&D organization. He led the U.S. Clinical Site Monitoring Organization R&D operations and implemented the original oncology and immunoscience field medical teams in U.S. medical affairs. Our guest's global achievement at BMS was leading the implementation of a field medical capability in Europe in support of various launches. So just prior to leaving BMS, our guest led the globalization of the medical information capability. He helped in harmonizing customer engagement through the implementation of global medical contact centers and centralizing medical content creation and curation, and implementing a multi-channel technology solution. By training, our guest is a physician assistant and holds a Master of Science degree in Business Administration and Human Resources Management. So we definitely know that he does not have a lack of degrees. Having said that, today's guest if you are in the life sciences, if you are working in medical affairs, if you are working in any kind of promotional capability, you're probably going to bang up against the scientific information that Factomizeorg is often connected with. So you probably should take a look and hear him out. If you're the CEO of a company, or of a life sciences company, I know a couple of you guys have already been guests on this podcast, take a look and hear some of the conversations we're having and consider joining Factomizeorg. And having said all that, and we'll get into the details again, but our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Reilly. Thank you again for coming on, Patrick.
Thank you, Darshan. My pleasure.
So Patrick, before we jump on, I do want to point out the Factomizeorg website. What is it before we talk? I mean, I gave you a little bit of a description, but what does that actually mean? How does this impact the average person working in the life sciences?
Sure. So Factomizeorg stands for Pharma Communication, Transparent Communication of Medical Information. It's an organization that we started, we originally got together about 7 years ago, and we incorporated 5 years ago. But as you mentioned, it's a collaboration of over 30 pharma companies, large and small across the industry. And it's really came together as a result of several of us years ago that were leaders in medical information, just really wanted to band together and see if we could solve some of the issues that we were dealing with as more of a collective effort than trying to face these things on an individual basis. So specifically what we're talking about is increasing awareness. I say increasing awareness of pharmaceutical medical information. It's really twofold. It's not just about increasing awareness of medical information, but it's about the credibility or the perceived trustworthiness of that medical information. And then the other aspect that drew us together was a lot of us were putting together what I'll call self-service sites, websites at our various company locations. And, I think we were struggling with this transition into a digital world and how we were going to navigate that more effectively. And we also recognized that, busy physicians, clinicians out there didn't want to look up, multiple sites for them to try to find information. So what we came up with was this idea of a one-stop shop. That's what factomizeorg really represents. It's the one place where you can go to, you can type in a drug, and ask a question, not ask a question, but also include in that query whatever you want to know about that drug. So drug dosage, drug interactions, things like that. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but that's kind of the background, and I think I've probably talked enough for right now.
I think you were great. So, simple question: were you the first person to start Factomize, or did Factomize exist before you?
No. So this was a group of us, as I said. So this is going back to 2013. I was at Bristol at the time, and there were a few colleagues at Pfizer and Lilly and myself that started having this conversation about, what if? Wouldn't it be cool if we could kind of come together and really talk about what our issues were more collectively? And there were a couple individuals that sort of took the bull by the horn. One individual in particular, Dominic Albana, who's still at Pfizer, who had a lot of contacts at the time. And we put together an email and we invited people to come to a meeting. That meeting was hosted. I was at BMS at the time. We hosted the meeting there. We had 19 companies represented, 17 of which were in the room. We had 2 that called in from the West Coast. And it was just an amazing experience to have everybody come together and be so willing to collaborate and share information. It's kind of mind-boggling for people that come from the commercial side, because this was, competition aside, these were a group of people that really wanted to work together.
So people wanted to put this information together. Was there, from your perspective, having worked in the industry, was there a need? Were patients asking for all of this, or did you sort of innately feel like this was missing?
Yeah. Well, I think, I think we have data that shows that physicians, again, to go back a little bit, medical has not been in the business of communicating directly to patients, right? You see a lot of direct-to-consumer kind of communication from a commercial side of organizations, but generally speaking, historically anyway, medical was sort of not in that space. And the reason being is that they didn't want to interrupt that patient-provider relationship. But as things have begun to evolve a little bit more, you are seeing a little bit more of medical communicating directly with patients. So it wasn't so much what we saw as a patient need or a patient request. It was really around what we saw from the data around how difficult it was for HCPs to obtain information. And we just wanted to try to make it easier. So the ease of use of obtaining this information.
Does that in any way change the importance of field medical science liaisons?
Oh gosh, no. You think about, people talk about multi-channel approaches to dealing with the customer. And I think medical affairs over the last 10, 15 years has really tried to work as in a coordinated effort. But at the end of the day, a lot of times there's these functional divides. But to answer your question, I worked in field medical. I had field medical organizations underneath me. And before I got into medical information, I think there's a great synergy. In fact, I think that most companies don't take full advantage of that. I think there's a great opportunity there to have people on the ground that are interacting, prior to COVID, obviously, face-to-face with physicians and other healthcare professionals. And the information that they use oftentimes is consistent with the information that medical information would otherwise provide. It's just a different dynamic. They come to medical information and it's more of a reactive, whereas I think when they're in there talking to their medical liaisons, it's more of a dialogue and they can actually probe and go in different directions with that. So it's a very transactional, or at least it has been very transactional with medical information. I think it's a two-way conversation when it comes to MSL. So I think there's benefit with both.
And there was still a gap between what they were saying and maybe reality, if you will, for lack of a better term. Why not go down trying to fix those relationships and go, look, you're doing this wrong. Here's the information that's accurate.
Yeah. Well, some of them actually, quite frankly, we reached out to them that they don't want to be part of it. I won't name names. But we actually did approach them, and they from their perspective, we represent pharma at the end of the day, and there's this I don't know how to describe it, sort of this perceived wall that they create that they don't want to be somewhat tainted in their minds with the information that they're providing.
Which raises the second question, right? And it's something you mentioned a few seconds ago. You talked about this idea that it all comes down to trust. Here's a simple question. Why have we lost trust, you think, with healthcare practitioners, with publishers, with anyone else?
Well, look, I mean, all that information you were sharing about my background, that was 30 years worth of experiences. And, when I first got into it, I make this reference that we're paying for the sins of our past, or at least we were for a number of years, until, people wised up and, of course they had to implement a lot of, regulations, and there were a lot of fines that went around. I'm talking about, DPAs and CIAs that were enforced that really put pharmaceutical companies back on the straight and narrow. But, I think up to that point, there were legitimate concerns, and again, things that were done by pharmaceutical companies that they deserve to some extent some of that, bad credibility or however you want to describe it that they got through this. Now, over the years, I think that's improved, tremendously, but there's a lag in the communication and understanding of where pharma companies are today versus where they were years ago. And specifically, I think, and this is really the difficult piece of the whole thing, is that, medical and what medical affairs represents in a pharmaceutical company is an area that is clearly different than the commercial side of the organization. They represent the commercial organization, they work effectively with the commercial organization, but at the end of the day, their interest lies in providing the best information and making sure that there's safe and effective use of their products. And at times, that might fly in the face of commercial when you can't really say that you would recommend your particular product. I mean, if it's something that's just not indicated in any particular patient, you have to be able to give that information. Now, we don't give guidance, we don't tell people how to treat their patients, but we give them the information, and then they can do with that what they want, in terms of treating their patients.
So we've got a situation now where obviously pharma is turning the corner, and they said we need to work together in a way that benefits healthcare providers in making smart decisions for the patient. And quite bluntly, that's why we all entered the industry. We hope that we can actually make a positive difference for patients. But when you're dealing with 31 plus organizations, it's a little bit like herding cats, I imagine. How is that difficult? How do you manage that?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to something you just said, and I was exposed to this several years ago, which is this collaboration. I think what you're seeing in the industry is more collaboration within companies, right? That you didn't see. There used to be a lot more silos, and I think between commercial and medical, there was a time when they couldn't even talk to each other. But I think that's starting to change again. But you're also seeing greater collaboration across the industry, and I think you referenced that. And I think with the most recent COVID, I think you're seeing pharmaceutical companies work on behalf of what's best for the patients. I think a lot of companies have adopted that sort of phraseology, that it's all about the patients or the patients first, and but I think that you're starting to see companies really live that, and I think you're seeing that within the industry. When it comes to working with Factomize, I think it's difficult from the standpoint that, and this gets in more into the compliance area, which you can appreciate, is that there are always different interpretations, versions of what I'll call the truth. But it's, whatever the guidelines are, whatever the regulations are, there is in some respects a black and white. There are areas of gray. And therein lies the differentiate between, company A, company B, company C, is how the people internally, the legal folks, interpret some of those regulations in that gray area. That's where it gets difficult for us to be able to kind of work across, 30 plus companies, because we have to make sure that we're not moving too fast and we're out front of everyone, and that makes them uncomfortable. So we try to stay within the guardrails. We try to be, within the constraints of the regulations, but we're also, entering an age where it's impossible for us to conduct business as we have in the past. Again, just referenced last year was a great example of that. We're all thrown into this digital world. We have to communicate differently. We have to use different means to provide information, to access information. And we're living by rules that were created years ago in terms of how that, from a regulatory standpoint, how we can do that. So there's the rub at the end of the day. But we're trying to, I think, with what we're doing with Factomize, we're trying to get a balance of that. We're trying to not ignore the regulations per se, but we're trying to say, realistically, what can we do here that's going to provide the best information in the fastest way for the physicians, clinicians at point of care. That's not going to be a hassle for them, right? We don't want them to go through all kinds of hoops to get this information. But on the flip side of that, we don't want to be doing things that companies that are part of Factomize would say, we don't want to be a part of this. So it's been an interesting kind of a dance, and it really is something that we learn along the way. But I would say, generally speaking, we've had pretty good success with it. And we continue every day, obviously, to communicate and educate. And you and I have talked about this a little bit, the industry, and how some people are more comfortable with certain situations than others. How do we at least make people aware of what the differences are and why people feel the way they do about certain regulations? You have to operate within the constraints of your own company and the restrictions that they have. But at the same time, I think what we're trying to accomplish is let's just have the conversation about how things are. And again, I think having you as part of Factomize most recently will hopefully foster that conversation a little bit more.
I'm excited to be a part of it, and I'm excited to talk about it. There's an interesting thing you mentioned. You talked about this this perspective of you don't want to go beyond what your member companies are comfortable with. On the other hand, Factomize by itself is also trying to be a little bit of a vanguard in terms of, okay, here's where the thought leadership's going. Here's how we can actually best help patients. And sometimes you industry need to actually get in on board to help patients in the best ways we can. So my question for you is, from it's entrepreneurial to be ahead of the curve, and it's safer to be in the middle of the curve. How do you draw that balance?
Well, again, I think that to use a specific example, we and to talk about how we share information in this day and age. A lot of companies have their own websites. There's some still that are part of Factomize that don't have websites. But they all have different ways of approaching how they provide information. The search capability, the sign-in capability, so on and so forth. And the approach that we took was really to kind of lean towards the majority of how people felt. And so, again, this delicate balance between what people feel safe doing versus what they had some reservations around. And at the end of the day, we don't force any of this on any company, right? So if we have a offering, if we have a technology solution, which we've been working on now for a while, we're going to make it available to all member companies for the purpose of them sharing their information more readily. But if they're uncomfortable with doing that, the way that we've approached this, they can opt out. If they're, and there's the in-between. There's those companies that are okay with some of it, but they want to be more restrictive in terms of some of the data that they share. There's mechanisms within this technology platform we've been working on to do that. And so, again, you have to strike a balance. You don't want to be out too aggressive, but at the same time, the purpose of what we do, and as part of our mission, is to catalyze innovation. It's really to get people to understand the opportunities, whether or not, again, they choose that. It's at the end of the day, is their choice. But at the same time, people want to know this too. We've had several companies that have approached us and said, could we just have this forum that you and I've talked about, whereby we could get legal compliance people to just talk about what these issues are and get other perspectives and walk away from that conversation and feel like, okay, this is not just a one-off. We had 30 plus companies represented today, and we had some good discussion around some of the issues that we're all grappling with. Again, did it change my mind at the end of the day? Maybe, maybe not. But it was the opportunity to surface some of these concerns.
So that's really interesting, right? You talk about innovation, you talk about sort of helping these companies even level set, if you will, for lack of a better term. If that's true, and that's true, when you talk about innovation, you talk about a future state. What is the future state, your preferred future state, your goal for Factomize in, say, 5 years? Or versus 10, whatever you think is a good timeline to achieve that.
Yeah, I think, our strategy is set up. It's very simple. We have two pillars, three if you include, what we want to do and focus on our membership. But the two major pillars are we want to help shape the future of medical information. And so, that could vary from, what we've been talking about in terms of technology offerings, or it could get down, excuse me for a second. It could get to the point of, how are we thinking about the future of medical information professionals, right? Again, when I joined, I got into medical information back, 10 plus years ago. Medical information professionals were really seen as more passive, behind closed doors, heads down, come and get me when you need me. And I think what you've seen is an evolution where medical information now is being seen as a real strategic partner to the medical affairs professionals as well as the commercial organization. And so this notion of helping to shape the future of medical information says, how can we work together to get out in front of what's happening? What are we seeing sort of on the horizon that's happening to our industry? Case in point, there are a lot of third parties that can provide medical information today. There's a lot of good technology out there that can go out and sweep the internet and provide answers to questions. One of the things that we hope to do with some of the work we're doing is we do it in a compliant way, but we also do it in a way that's, helping physicians treat their patients better without, having to go to, all kinds of hoops, like I said, to try to find that information. So again, shaping the future of medical information is a lot of things, but if you were to ask me again, 5 years from now, I'd love to say that Factomize has been playing a real role, has a seat at the table with really determining, where, we as an industry are going as it relates to providing medical information for clinicians and patients. I think, again, there's been a movement in that direction. The second, pillar is around being a go-to provider, and that ties into, again, what we've been talking about from a technology standpoint. We want to be, a trusted, reliable source of information. We think that we have a platform now that we can offer, not just when you come to factomize.org, but that we have now created an API, an enhanced search capability that we can position on other platforms. So we could augment some of these sources of third-party sources by providing what we control, we create within our own organizations. We can enhance the workflow of clinicians, physicians, when they're working on their EHRs, EMRs, because we can position this source within, again, the EHR platform. So these are the kinds of things that we're doing in terms of our phase 2 approach with our technology. And again, in 5 years, I'd love to be able to say, Factomize is kind of the go-to standard of medical information.
So let's delve into that a little bit more, because the evolution of medical information is upon us. And what I mean by that is we're now reaching a point where there are multiple points of truth, if you will. I just did an interview with Jim Nasser, who talks about blockchain, and he does all that kind of stuff. And he's talking about things like fake media and how do you validate quote unquote fake media or fake news. How do you see a future where Factomize becomes a source of validating what is actually true?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that the future's now. I mean, that's what we believe. That's what we think we represent, sort of the single source of information. Now, when I say that, you can only take that so far because, what we, the cachet for us is we did the clinical development. We have the clinical data. That is what we use to support our products. When those products are out in the free market and they're being used, there's a lot of information, as you well know, that that a lot of organizations are accumulating that tells more about that product, in the real world, right? But up to that point, and I think even beyond that, pharma's in a good position, and I think medical information and the medical affairs organizations are in a great position to say, look, we're the source of this. We're the only ones that have all the data that's not just in the label, but outside the label that we can provide that's going to help you make decisions around your patient care. And I think, again, that's what starts to differentiate us from other third-party providers.
And when you talk about medical information, it's not always just the question that's asked, but the question that didn't get asked.
Yeah, exactly.
And that becomes very complicated. And that speaks to the issue of trust between pharma and healthcare practitioners and pharma and patients. And in those situations, patients, I was just talking to someone earlier, and their point was, I feel like someone's hiding the ball, and I'm looking at only the side they want me to see.
Yeah.
So how does, in a perfect world, how does Factomize go, let me give you all sides of the story so that you can ask the questions you want to ask and get the answers you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think, oddly enough, I think some of this, really boils down to just customer service. And, I think we get a little bit caught up at times by thinking that there's, we're in a box and we can only provide so much information.
Yeah.
I recognize that we were not in a position, nor should we be in a position, to make suggestions like, okay, you asked this, but do you really want this? But at the same time, there is, as you mentioned, there's always a question behind the question, right? And I think that you want to go back to your question around MSLs. I think that's what they have the opportunity to do, because it's dialogue.
Right.
I think when you think of medical information, traditional medical information is transactional. One of the things that I think handicapped us, and I think is being addressed to some extent with contact centers and the way that we interact with customers, is that you want to be able to probe and make sure you're answering the question. Again, you don't want to provide too much information, but at the same time, you want to know that you answered the question. And so what I'm suggesting is that there's an opportunity to have more dialogue, even in that setting, not dissimilar to what you would have, when you have an MSL sitting down with a healthcare professional.
The last question I have for you before I let you go, and thank you for this. This has been an incredible conversation. Factomize has been primarily a 31 of the largest or the most reputable pharma companies, and I'm using the word reputable in a way that I mean reputable, but people would argue big pharma. But ignoring that part of it, the truth is that these companies often have all the information associated with their drugs. The future I see is generic companies coming on and going, we too have information.
Yeah.
Their information will be referencing information that the brand companies have.
Yeah.
Do you see a inherent conflict there, or do you think that is the exact reason why they should work together?
Well, I think it's the latter. I don't think it's a conflict, nor should it be. And again, if you step back from this and what we were talking about before is, why are we doing this, right? It's for the good of the patient, right? And that might sound altruistic or hokey or whatever you want to call it, but at the same time, people in our industry believe that. I believe that. And I think whatever we can do to go back to, again, this concept of collaboration, greater collaboration, we need to do it. Factomize was born out of, 19 companies that were, strictly speaking, the largest small pharmas, primarily large initially, but we've now brought on smaller companies, startup companies. And, I'm not closed-minded to, having other organizations, other companies, be they medical device or, as you say, generic companies to join. Because again, we're all in the business of providing information, right? We're information providers. And I think, we want to ensure that people that are treating, your mom, your sister, my aunt, my uncle, are getting the best information they possibly can, right? And I think there's a way to do that, but it does take some leap of faith, maybe on people's part, to believe that, you can trust, what we're trying to do. And I think, again, that's the ongoing work that we have on our plate. And I think, it's we call it awareness, Darshan, but I think it really is about education. I think it's really about effectively communicating what we do. That's really based in the science. That is, it is evidence-based. It's trustworthy information. And once people, I think, start to understand that, I think they'll have less resistance to coming to us for information.
So Patrick, we could keep going on this for forever. I'm gonna pivot to a new segment that we have on this podcast, and it's gonna be 10 rapid fire questions for you.
Oh, this is I'm hot seat now. I gotcha. I was waiting for this to happen. Okay, fire away.
Okay. What is an accomplishment you're most proud of?
Oh gosh. Oh man. I used to be able to just rattle this off. I think honestly, and this is more on a personal level, I'm one of 9 children, and I was, one of the first to actually get into college and graduate. And, I came from humble beginnings. And I just, I'm always proud of that, to know that I, had help along the way, but, not to the degree that some do. And so I think, what I've been able to accomplish in life, getting educated and being successful in my career is probably what I'm most proud of.
That's awesome. Who is your hero or heroine, and why?
Well, my mom. How about that? My mom's passed, but I think of people in my life that had the greatest influence on me, and she was number one. There's no question about it. I think of people. What's that?
Just out of curiosity, what is your favorite lesson from her that sort of always echoes in your mind? That's not one of the questions, by the way, but I'm just curious.
Yeah. No, again, it was sort of the golden rule. I think you treat people like you want to be treated, and I think you give everybody a fair shot. And I think you can't be judging people based on, their color, their opinions. It's really about just being open-minded and recognizing, you used to say all the time, it takes 2 to tango, or there's always 2 sides, or maybe sometimes 3 sides of the story. And so you have to be able to step back from your position and not be so passionate at times, but really appreciate, what other people are dealing with, and what, how you might find a way to interact more effectively with.
What is your favorite way to give back to your community?
Oh boy. I think this is where I feel like, I haven't done enough, in terms of, coworkers and friends that have gotten involved in a lot of, nonprofit kinds of opportunities and charitable kinds of things. I would say, I guess I'm a little embarrassed to say, nothing pops up at me in terms of my community, contributions, other than just being a good citizen.
I'm going to add one for you, because I'm not going to let you go that easily on that one. I'm going to add one for you. It's basically creating a source of truth for patients. I think that's a pretty good way to get back to the community.
Yeah, my head immediately goes to like my local community. But I think if you talk about the work that we're doing, if there's a legacy to be had with what we're doing here, I think that's exactly it, Darshan. So thank you.
You're welcome. How do you define success?
Well, I think success for me is above and beyond, what you could ever plan for. And I think, success is being able to achieve, things that you recognize were an opportunity, that you plotted out a course to try to accomplish that, and that you can, at some point look back and say, we were good. We made it happen. I think a lot of times, and I think there's a lot of people like this that, kind of get lost in the journey, meaning to say that they don't really appreciate success because they're always continuing to look for greater success. But I think success for me is again, hitting some milestones, but taking a breath and really looking back and saying, okay, we were able to do some really cool stuff. And, I think generally speaking, I've had the good fortune of that in my career, in a lot of different, areas. And, but, more often than not, you don't appreciate that until you've kind of gotten there and look back on it, as opposed to, being happy with, or content with, what you're in the middle of trying to achieve.
What challenges you?
Oh, I think what challenges me is problems. I love, to be able to, figure stuff out and try to provide solutions and make connections with people so that they, I've always said, I don't know if I'm stealing a line from Ronald Reagan, you know, I may not be the brightest person in the world, but I like to believe that, you know, through my, you know, experiences, through my kind of savviness, through my own personal integrity, that I, you know, try to be in a position to make things, you know, more positive, you know, the glass half full sort of an approach in life. And, you know, that's, you know, I will always live by that. I think that that's, you know, if I can help somebody else and figure out a problem and be the solution as opposed to the problem, that makes me happy.
Speaking of Ronald Reagan, what is your favorite movie?
Well, you know, I always jump to Shawshank Redemption, but you know, I think there's others. It was funny. I was just watching, while I was in the hospital, I had some work done recently, and it was, oh my God, now I'm blanking out on it, but it's an older movie, and I just loved it. I hadn't seen it in a long time. Sundance. Oh my God, Sundance Kid. Which Casting Sundance, yeah. Which Casting Sundance Kid, great movie. And you know, for its time, it was actually cinematically, it was pretty cool.
Okay. If you won $1 million, what would you buy?
What would I buy? Could I pay off some bills? How about that? I'd like to pay off, you know, yeah, my mortgages, so that I could relax a little bit on that. Yeah, I don't know if I want to go out and buy anything. I want to just reduce my liabilities a little bit.
Okay. And if you could add a person to Mount Rushmore, who would it be and why?
Oh boy. So many options there. You know, I don't have a good, you know, it's horrible. I'm, you know, all these different things are going through my head, but I just, you know, part of me is struggling with, you know, this whole issue. I don't want to get into politics here, but, you know, Mount Rushmore is one of those things that people have questioned in terms of, you know, is it something that we should really honor still? But take that out for a second and just say that I don't know, maybe something that represents, and again, I can't come up with an individual person per se, but I think anything that represents, especially these days, teachers in our society. I think, you know, I hear stories. I personally haven't been impacted by this, but you know, what we've gone through the last year, and I think continue to deal with in terms of lack of, you know, a structured school routine, and how parents are now being asked to step up and do some of the things that, you know, they had relied on teachers to do in the past. I think that there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, you know, and I'll throw, you know, parents into the mix, because I think a lot of parents have had to step up and really assume some responsibilities that, quite frankly, it's, you know, it's a major juggling act on any given day. But I think that, again, we talk about, and now I'm going to go off on a jag, but I think, you know, I mentioned teachers, but you know, God, how could you leave out, you know, first line responders, you know, and people of that ilk that really are doing some amazing things in this day and age, that, you know, and putting their lives, you know.
Patrick, I'm really worried about your Mount Rushmore. There are a lot of people on there right now.
Yeah. So next version of this, part 2, I'll come up with some specific people that I could throw. How about that?
And last question: would you rather an easy life or an interesting life?
Easy versus interesting?
Yeah.
Oh my God, interesting. Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, my personal life, you know, not to dwell on, but I mean, there's been nothing easy about my life. Okay. You know, and I think that's great. I mean, I've learned so much. I mean, you know, yeah, easy's, oh, thank you.
Okay, so during this podcast, we actually discussed a variety of things. We talked about trust. We talked about the goals and the values of Factomize. We talked about how you started Factomize with several people. We talked about the role of field-based MSLs and what that could evolve into. We went into the idea of the goals of medical information, whether it's impacting healthcare practitioners or it's impacting patients, and how that can be optimized. We also talked about the entrepreneurial spirit versus the don't exceed what your membership allows for, and how you balance the needs of those two. We then went into things like just creating trust, and from there we actually talked about the difficulty and yet the opportunities that bringing multiple organizations together allows for, and the future of Factomize from there. And then we really put you on the spot. We talked about the rapid fire question.
Yeah. Well, we'll delete the last section of that podcast. How about that?
I thought it was great, to be honest. Patrick, if people want to reach you, where can they find you?
Yeah, they can find me at Patrick at factomize.com.
And that's PHAC.
Sorry. Boy, shame on me. Patrick at factomize.org, not .com, .org.
.org. And if for those of you who are looking, there at the bottom we have a scrolling text bar that tells you factomize.org. So you can go there.
There you go.
And if you like this podcast, please leave a message and leave a comment, subscribe. You can leave a comment. I'm happy to reach out to Patrick for you if you like. You can find me on Twitter at DarshanTalks, or just go to our website at DarshanTalks.com. Thanks, Patrick.
Awesome. Thank you, Darshan. Really appreciate it.
This is the DarshanTalks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.